Well, welcome everyone to the 30-minute case study webinar series. This is John Sankey. I'm an engineer for TrueBlue Technologies. That's a sales engineering firm that represents Aestus, Tersus Environmental, TRS Group, and West Bay Instruments. So this is a series of presentations that focus on the main topic of managing complex sites with high-resolution site characterization and then focused remediation. Today, we're pleased to have Dr. Todd Hallahan discuss how scanning data has facilitated an M&A remedy at an LNAPL site. Todd is a professor and the Sun Chair of Hydrogeology at Oklahoma State University and serves as the Chief Technical Officer for Aestus. Recently, he gave talks all over the world as the NGWA McElhaney Lecturer. So Todd, thanks again and for presenting this case study. You now have the lead.
Thanks, John. And John, you're hearing me, right?
I can hear you loud and clear.
I always like to check that.
If anyone has any problems, please just use the chat panel to let us know.
And we want to be respectful of your time, so we do these as 30 minutes, so roughly 20 minutes with the Q&A. If you have grand desire to listen to me chat about electrical properties of the subsurface for another 6 or 10 hours, let me know. I'm always happy to do that. But the plan for this one is to be 20 minutes with the Q&A. So there's a chat function that you can submit questions in the wonderful world of non-in-person life that we're living now. And feel free to stick around. If you want to keep asking questions, we'll keep answering them. So, and it's being recorded for you, so there'll be a video available that if you want to watch it later or need to show somebody something, that's all available. And you get a CEU certificate so that if you're racking up your points, you can get your frequent flyer miles. We're giving a Starbucks gift card away, and the drawing will be held. And if you submit questions, you get more chances. And it's fairly similar to Publisher Clearinghouse, just at a smaller level. So the case study for today, we've had a dog theme going in these webinars, so we're continuing the dog theme with a site where the site was discovered not by any environmental professional, but by a dog that came out of the woods covered in hydrocarbons. When you get a site like this, you've got several issues. You want to know what the distribution of the impacts are, but looking at it, figuring out where to go for an old pipeline that's through a wooded area. The landowner doesn't particularly want all of his trees cut down, and trying to sort out what's happening can be a bit tricky. But today's talk is also focused on if you're going to remediate it, what do you know about habitat for guys that might want to chew on hydrocarbons? And we've done a couple hundred different projects and different levels of watching bugs grow on the subsurface. And I'll usually point out, and I will again, that I'm not a microbiologist. I'm a guy who looks at what they look like when you're looking at them electrically. So I'm sort of a remote sensing person. I'm off the planet seeing what the people are doing and telling you what patterns I'm seeing. I don't know why somebody in New York City wants to do something. I just look at them and see that off the planet they're doing these things. So same thing, I'm standing on top of the ground putting electricity into it, and then we can see that lots of features look like there's a bunch of microbes hanging out. And what we're finding over time as we're building up this set of cases of what their distribution looks like is that habitat's really important. Like, why are they happy somewhere? Because some cases, for a long time, we thought, okay, if it's old enough, the bio will take over. But now we have really old cases where the bio didn't take over. And we have really young cases where it did take over. And that's what this case is today, is a case where pretty new leak and lots of bio. So we do electrical hydrogeology. So that's passing electricity through the earth, figuring out which parts are conductive and resistive, and getting that pattern on a high resolution basis, and then marrying that up with the traditional hydrogeology data that people are used to, thinking about borings and BTEX data and what your PIDs are saying and where the geologic breaks are and where your well screens are at. And then putting that into 3D, because we're going to work at a data density that's a lot higher. And so we're going to be working at about the 10 to 100,000 data point level in 3D to be able to figure out a site. And so this is a site in Missouri looking at a karst issue and figuring out where the gasoline went down into a flat surface site that has karst structures down below it and figuring out where the flow was at. And so putting those pieces together is required to be able to figure out what's happening on these sites. And for the more complicated a site gets, the harder it is to poke with a drill and just happen to find the right spot. And if you do happen to find the right spot, do you know what it means in context? So that's what electrical hydrogeology does. It gives you that context to be able to look across the site and be able to understand a bit more about what life is going on down there. So if you want to look at microbial things in the subsurface, my best analogies of thinking about that, one is thinking about something getting moldy. So if you stick your cheese in the fridge and then wait for a few months, you can develop one of these exercises. If you want to make it go a little faster, you can leave it out on the counter. But when you have things get moldy, they don't do that in a regular pattern. They usually get a spot first, and then they get some parts growing over it, and usually the surface of the cheese is getting more, and if you cut it open, you can still find some good stuff. Same things happen in the subsurface, except the cheese is your hydrocarbons, and they are resistive products in the subsurface, and then you're growing conductors over the top of them, but you're not growing it in a pattern that is a nice engineered pattern. You're growing it like mold on a cheese. It's a weird little pattern that develops in relatively unpredictable ways. I also put another source of carbon on the right. We've got sites that have plenty of carbon in them, and this is a fruitcake, and fruitcakes can last over 100 years, and no microbes ever touch that carbon. So we have sites like that where, wow, the microbes should be going crazy here, and they're just doing nothing. And there's different viewpoints of why, and the microbiologists have lots of opinion about that. For me, looking at them, taking pictures of where they seem to be moldy and where they're not moldy, the pattern is not simple. And I found a quote from Harvard Law that says, if you got nice, rigorously controlled experimental conditions, the organisms are still going to do as they damn well please. And I would support that comment now based on looking at lots of sites about where microbes we found them and where they weren't growing. They seem to have their own deal that they're doing. Some people on the geophysical side have gone into this, and this is biogeophysics. What does life do with geophysical signals? And so this is work from Estela Adequana's group, and she went and crossed the line and started like trying to do microbial experiments and working with microbiologists and doing stuff in the lab to figure out what microbes are actually doing on the small scale, and has figured out that, okay, if you put some sort of LNAPL in the subsurface, hydrocarbons in this case, you'll make the ground more resistive for a refined product of some sort. Those things are liquid resistors. They go on the ground, they make the ground less conductive. But if you start having critters grow on them, the cheese gets moldy. If the conductivity is going to increase, they're going to start chewing on the mass, and then they're going to get rid of the mass, but it'll still stay conductive for a while as they're doing the rest of their things. So we have these patterns of impacts being both conductive and resistive, but they stand out because they're changing. One, on the resistive side, you're seeing the impact. The other on the conductive side, where you're watching the cheese get really moldy. If we look really close at this, and this is some pictures from Dr. Adequana, is you've got these guys that they are working with electricity. And so their biofilms are conductive. Their nanowires, if they have them, that's little wires running around, those are conductive. They do things with metals. They make magnetite sometimes. They do a lot of weird things, and it depends on the species and their habitat and all these sorts of things. And we see lots of weird things on our sites, but the science for what they're doing and whether they're happy or sad or doing something as a byproduct or doing something on purpose, I would say we're still relatively primitive scientifically in terms of understanding them and what they're doing. I think we're probably about at 5% level of knowing that they exist, knowing some things about them, but understanding how they're growing and what they're doing. And if we wanted to think about like farming them, if these were our cattle out there and we're going to grow them and raise them to nice happy cattle chewing on our hydrocarbons, I'd say we're about 5% in towards knowing how to do that well. The other thing on the protocol basis is this is similar protocols to thinking about x-raying a site or taking an MRI of a site on a medical basis and then seeing a tumor and biopsying the tumor and seeing what's going on at that location. The confirmation drilling for this to say, hey, we've got life and it exists and they're happy and here's what they're doing next. That's really variable in the industry about what's the right thing to sample to say that life exists and is happy doing the reaction you would like to have happen. And also the modeling is saying the biology, there's a lot of guys that'll eat stuff or do stuff that is not the reaction that you want. They just happen to be taking advantage of the environment that you provided. So, you know, you invited all these people to your party and somebody came in and started drinking down the keg. You know, it's not what you want to have happen, and controlling some of those things that happen on the subsurface, just providing habitat doesn't necessarily get to, excuse me, doesn't get you the right folks to the party. So that protocol of what do you confirm and what do you confirm over time, biologically in the industry, from a person who's not a microbiologist, I feel there's still variation in what's the right sample to take and what do we want to know about how whether they're happy or not. So here's our site in terms of the geologic conceptual model that was developed from all this work. And we're going to talk about the answer, so that we go through and work out how we got to the answer. There's some complexity that I wanted to talk about at the beginning. So we've got this relatively fine-grained site with a lignite and some silts, and there's a coarse-grained channel sitting on top of it that sort of controls about where the water table sits. And that pipeline is sitting up over that coarse-grained channel and snaps and puts hydrocarbons down into this thing. Well, most of them ended up in the silt, and you would expect to see that hydrocarbon is going to have anoxic conditions, and if it's got microbe development, well, it's going to take a while to get started. But we had a really weird sort of situation. We had very oxic conditions. That channel of coarse-grained material being up in the vadosome is basically acting as sort of a linear air sparge unit sitting over the top of it, and that kept it in an oxic condition. And we think the bugs might have been hanging out with the lignite bed and having those carbon sources, that they basically went up and started populating this thing very quickly. Either that or the pipeline had a really small leak for a while that helped develop the colony. We don't have data over long periods of time, but this colony, relative to the known time where the pipeline broke, was very quick to go in and basically envelop all this area. So we were looking for an area where we see a resistor come out of the pipeline and go into the coarse-grained channel and maybe go down to the silt a bit. What we found was an incredibly electrically conductive site with very oxic conditions that were degrading hydrocarbon. So at the end, we learned that the hydrocarbon was in those fine-grained sediments below the coarse-grained layer. They basically, the lateral extent was defined by where the coarse-grained layer ended. And then we could pick off the hydrocarbons with blob anomalies, these sort of things that were sitting there underneath the coarse-grained layer that were more resistive than the area around them, but they were still pretty conductive. And we looked for whether, when the pipeline break occurred, did anything end up as a diving plume, and we didn't find anything that was diving. We just found lignite down there. So, you know, you're going through the forest. One of the advantages of being able to look around electrically is that you just need a straight line and you can leave all the trees in place. You clear the undergrowth so that you can walk around and put cables out, but you don't have to cut down the whole forest to look around. So this is the distribution, and they had put in a number of wells ahead of time before they figured out that this site wasn't normal. And somebody came in and we added some confirmation borings. The pink star is the pipeline break location. And we were looking around relative to what they knew about the site and trying to figure out what's going on in the site. And image one told us something was really bizarre, because it didn't look like the electrical properties you'd expect for the conceptual model of a fresh hydrocarbon coming out of a pipe in a porous media setting like we had. So the images come in something like this, and we get this distribution of electrical properties. And if you've ever looked at these things, they're these little trapezoids that we get. The surface topography is surveyed in there. And you look at it and you go, I'm looking for something like pretty resistive for hydrocarbons. And we get some resistance up near the pipeline break, but turns out that's just coarser grain material. And you get this stuff that's way too conductive. We've got all this distribution of colors down at the bottom, and it's breaking out structures so that you can see them. But the straight lines there, it's basically horizontal stratigraphy. And a lot of electrical stuff, once you get down into those fines, it's all vertical things. And that's what we tend to see from microbial activity. They don't care about horizontal stratigraphy. The mold just shoots straight across fines and shoots across bedrock areas and things like that, and they grow to where they want to. If you want some entertainment, go online and look up slime mold races, and you can watch slime molds race across things to where they want to go. So the microbes in the subsurface, once they get going, they seem to do these sorts of things, and they'll connect the top and bottom of a site quite effectively. And so we've got these structures to work with. And so we can then look for how do we target the hydrocarbons, and then what do we have to figure out about the living things in here? Because instead of being a site with nice fresh hydrocarbons that we're going to recover, this is a really moldy site. We popped open the fridge and the cheese is already completely covered in mold. And so the approach for that when you're looking around electrically is different. But you also start thinking about remediation a bit differently. Is if this is a new spill and it's this crazy conductive, hey, should we think about bioremedies or should we think about M&A? Should monitored attenuation be the right answer? What are those answers on the biological side? Because obviously life really likes this area. So data integration wise, you've got to put all the data together, and you put the geology on there, and you put the PIDs on there, and you put all the chemical samples. You do that in 2D and 3D, and you look at where the spill was, you look at what targets you've got, and you come up with some locations to confirmation drill to test hypotheses and check what's going on. You know what things could be electrically, but you can just find the tumors, and you know that the values electrically correlate with this type of tumor or that type of tumor. And so then you biopsy the tumors and figure out what you're looking at. And that's where you're figuring out those bits and pieces about the coarse grain layer being pretty important for distribution, and that the lignite down below was maybe controlling why the biology was so effective. So then you got to model in some things to go, okay, well, if that's true, where is this coarse grain layer at? And so taking the data, working between confirmation borings and electrical data to map out where the surfaces are at. You can figure out this coarse grain channels running through there. And relative to silts, this isn't like really coarse like pea gravel. This is coarser sands and some gravels and things like that. But that distribution told us basically it mapped the edge of the hydrocarbon really nicely on the west side, and also gave us a good extent of understanding. If we look at it from the side view, we could see that the hydrocarbons were down below it, and we could see that it wasn't that much distance between them. And so this nice coarser grain thing sitting in the vadose zone might be what's supplying your oxygen. And so thinking about who you've got living where and how are they getting what they're getting. Are we expecting them to run out of oxygen pretty soon? And the answer is no. We haven't seen any drop in that over time while we're assessing the site, and it looks like that they're getting plenty refreshed from that channel sitting on top of the system. So it's thinking about what's the habitat for them. Are they going to be less happy over time? Or are they going to stay what they're doing? What's going to be going on with this population as we move forward based on the parameters that they might run out of something. And I've worked on sites where basically have run out of the material they need to do what they want to do, and they stop working. So it's looking at these things from the different angles, assembling those data about what the habitat is and why they're happy where they're living. And it's always hard to figure out. It's like asking a bunch of humans, hey, why do you guys live where you live? And they've got a whole range of different answers. I don't think these guys' answers are much different. Oh, my kids live here, my parents live here. A lot of these sort of habitat things are universal across the sizes of biological organisms, but we need to figure out whether they're happy and why they're happy if we're going to understand how to basically farm them for our purposes. The other thing we got to check in data is, well, maybe with a pipeline break, maybe there's a lot of salt in there or something that we didn't really know about. So we can look for, is there a high EC kick or more electrically conductive part of the subsurface because it's salty? And we've got this impacted well on the right that biologically is active, and it's got lower chloride and lower EC than the stuff to the left side of the image. Checking against those, what you'll normally see is that your impacts and your conductance that you derive from these data sets, they'll separate from an EC versus the conductance you derive from these data sets, or a chloride. And you see how the conductance of the fluid is not the conductance of the picture. And that separation is what you can do to go, okay, somebody's living there, because they're not correlated closely. They're very different sorts of areas. So we had multiple lines of evidence for biodegradation in this case. In general, highly electrically conductive areas suggest widespread biological activity, and they didn't have high chloride hits at where the most conductive areas were in the pictures. The geochemical habitat, you had a nice coarse grain layer acting like an air sparge system. You had positive ORP, positive DO values across all this impacted area that you'd think should go anoxic fairly quickly, and it wouldn't. It was very stable in that way. And then using microbial insights, petroleum quantarray to confirm biological activity is there, and they're happy eating what you've provided. A lot of projects I work on, I'm also interested in who else might be there, because when you got this problem of who's competing for things, you start thinking about some of these habitat issues, and getting insight to that is additional funds, but I think at some point we're gonna have to figure out who else is there and are they a problem? And we've got to start thinking about, you know, farm management a little more than just dumping carbon in the subsurface and hoping somebody eats it, or adding something to help them, give them enough nutrients. We got to think about farming practices a bit more. So ended up with remedial design inputs for the site that, hey, we think we can target your higher saturations, higher carbon. We confirmed that when we put the wells in, they were dissolve phase, but they weren't free product. And about 2 months later, free product showed up in a couple of wells, but we knew where those were, and they were in fine grain medium. It took a couple of months to show up. So it fit the conceptual model very nicely. And we had multiple lines of evidence saying hydrocarbon degradation is ongoing. And there was a question of, well, is there some way to get this stuff to migrate? And so field tested the mobility. Our consultant was great in terms of going out there and demonstrating all the pieces you need to make a really strong case of, yes, it's there, it's not moving anywhere. We can show you how this stuff is set up. We can show you it's not particularly mobile. And so after several meetings and discussions and going back out to prove things, the state approved an M&A as a remedy. And that wasn't the original remedy plan by the consultant. It was the data sets were saying this probably makes the most sense, and it made the most sense to the regulatory community as well. So, you know, when you're going into these things, taking electrical pictures, you don't exactly, people want the, well, tell us what you're going to find, and you want to find out what's going on, but knowing what's going on ahead of time sometimes is very different, and this was a case like that. Key factors. You got to have a team that's looking for technical solutions. So if people are trying to worry about the politics and the regulatory thing, if they went in, we know we're going to use this method of remediation, it wouldn't have worked, because we changed a lot about how we were going to deal with the site, because we weren't planning on an M&A remedy at all. It's just that's what the data said we should do. After a couple hundred sites, the microbial patterns, mold grows as it pleases. You do not get a nice pattern. It doesn't care about the geology. It just grows across things and shoots around, and it's doing what it wants on a habitat basis. It's not doing what it wants on an engineering basis. I'd like a nice layer to show up. It doesn't do that. And it's an iterative process. Regulators had some questions. We were sorting out what we want to do on a regulatory or remediation basis, and went back and forth to sort it out to where everybody was happy with the solution and it made sense technically. So we found that new spills, we conceptually were thinking if you go out to something new, it should not be all that bioactive. They might be highly bioactive. And we were finding out, and we found this out over time, if you've got a highly bioactive site, you can have high saturation zones that are electrically conductive. They're going to be different from the lower saturation zones, but they're not going to be a big resistor. They're going to be a different zone that has bugs growing around it. And then if we're thinking about farming and you're going in and I'm going to have bugs do something for you, you got to understand the habitat structure. So if we look at a map of the US at night and think about the habitat structure, you know, the lights are on and these guys work with electricity too, and they seem to like being near the coast. But if you wanted me to explain to you why Denver exists, I don't know, it's in the middle of the domain. I don't see a ton of water around there, and there seems to be some habitat growing there quite happily. So when you're doing that in the subsurface, the same way I can tell you where they're at, I can tell you what's near them, but sometimes understanding the why part is pretty tricky. And as far as I can tell from the microbiologist's quotes, it's tricky for them as well. So whatever scale you're on, life does what it wants to do. Moving forward, understanding how to sample life is pretty important, and we're not great at that yet. We can also think about watching life grow over time. So we put in electrical wells and take data sets to watch the ground change. And if they're growing, they should get more conductive. We should be able to watch that. And then relative to thinking about farming these guys, we're sort of going out in the woods and picking crops off of trees, but we're not really farming yet in terms of how we're dealing with these sites. So I want to open up to questions and see what you guys have questions about, what you're thinking about it. Stuart?
Oh, yes. We have one question here. I understand that Aestus work was instrumental to arriving at a least cost M&A remedy. What was the ballpark cost for Aestus effort, field, and office? Does Aestus participate in regulatory meetings?
I'll do that a more generic answer. Typical sites for us in terms of, and I think about whether it's a remediation activity or a characterization activity, is that a 10,000 thing, a 100,000 thing, or $1 million thing, or a $10 million thing? And essentially scanning a site, putting in 3D, and doing all the data integration and analysis and all that is a $100,000 thing. And it'd be great if it was a $10,000 thing, but with all the parts and pieces, there's a ton of labor involved. So you end up at that kind of mark. So it might be 70,000, it might be 120, but that's sort of the range of what kinds of things happen. In terms of participating in regulatory meetings, the state didn't have a clue about doing electrical hydrogeology and what that meant and how to put these things together and stuff. So I think I had a 4-hour regulatory meeting with them in terms of sitting through and giving them the stuff ahead of time, and then going in and answering all the questions and, hey, what about this? What about this? And walking them through which piece of evidence supports which piece. And answering all those questions is really important because it's sort of a new way to think about the subsurface. But it got to, everybody could see on the data set basis that this was the right answer. It wasn't a company going in and saying, hey, can you get us an M&A? We want to get out of this site. It was going in, hey, we need to clean this up. And we're like, it looks like you should leave it and monitor it. And it wasn't the answer we expected to get to. So having the really good team was super important, but we're always happy to go in and chat with regulators about how to utilize the data and what it tells you and what it doesn't tell you. So
I wanted to add our most successful projects, I think, are ones where we meet with our typically consulting firm client, potentially their client, the RP, and then also the regulatory agency up front, so we can discuss what's about to happen, field questions, get folks on the same page with the technology. And then at the back end, there's fewer questions about the data and what was expected, things like that. So we really enjoy that process if we can be involved with the regulators early on if it's appropriate. Another question from Steve Hash. I can't find the questionnaires, so I'll ask here. Well, you found the questionnaires, Steve. What were the alternative remedies on the table in addition to M&A? What was the ballpark life cycle cost savings of M&A versus alternatives?
And I'll put that over to you, Stuart, as I'm not I normally think about characterizing, but in terms of all the remedial options, it wasn't that they saved a ton of money in characterization, but in terms of saving on remediation, it wasn't coming out of the ground here. So you'd be out there a long time pulling on nothingness in a remote area. So I don't know the total cost, but I do know that the time-wise, the total time would be quite extensive.
Yes, we actually have, luckily enough, our consulting firm client on the phone here, who's offered to chime in and help answer that question, as this is more directly what he'd be involved with. His name is Brian Thomas. And Brian, I think you're self-muted, so there you go.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Well, it's interesting jurisdictional environment. I'll just say in the outset of this project, we knew we'd be faced with a challenge because it's not a non-degradation state, but essentially you're traditionally handling releases like this with a dig and haul remedy, full source removal, no residual PSH, or to the extent practicable removal. And we were talking about a multiple acre area, over 60,000 cubic yards of affected media. So we had looked at a number of different remedies, and that was part of the process that made this evaluation make a lot of sense. And it did add a lot of value in terms of the endpoint for the client, because this regulatory climate would not typically be conducive to leaving this type of material in place, but working through it with the multiple lines of evidence that Todd spoke to, We had pilot testing for different remedial approaches. So essentially, this layered data set with the natural attenuation data from microbial insights, electrical resistivity presentation that Todd put forth, and our knowledge of the site, we got to an endpoint that was significantly more cost effective. And again, we went in expecting to do some sort of removal or in situ treatment activity.
Stuart, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Thanks, Todd. Thank you, Brian, very much. Any other questions? Yes, one more just came in from Todd Miller. Are there subsurface conditions that represent limiting factors with this type of technology?
We've imaged in saline mud flats. We've imaged in dry granite. And so it's just passing electricity through. The most complicated picture to take, it's similar to photography. If you have low light or bright light, you adjust and that's easy. It's if you have low light and bright light at the same time. So if you have really big conductors and really big resistors at the same time, that's the hardest picture to take. And so it'd be a degrading DNAPL is your toughest picture to take. But the conditions of whether you're in an urban area or whether you're a rural area or whether you're going through woods or over water, all those things are just the engineering logistics, and we've gotten through all those. So it's just taking the images, and we've got a ton of QA/QC protocols to make sure that the picture's of good quality and what it means for drilling objectives. So, figuring out how to do MRIs of the belly, we figured that all out. It's just figuring out when you see really weird stuff, when you're on the weird medical show of something that somebody walked in with something bizarre, what does that mean for sampling, and what does that mean as you try to get to the regulatory endpoints? So we're generally focused on, hey, we need to get to a regulatory endpoint, and how do we get there, and what's the data going to say, and how to best do that to get the best integrated data set so that you have answers that the regulator will accept.
Yeah, we've designed the technology to work in any geology at virtually any site in the world, and so far it has, and we've done a lot of different projects in different environments. There's another question from Joe about Aestus staff expertise. I think that's the question is what is our level of expertise in what fields and so forth.
So I come out of physics background, followed by a couple of graduate degrees in geology. And so I look at it from a hydrogeologist standpoint with a bunch of physics behind it. So I'm a professional geophysicist and certified driller in Oklahoma, which is a weird combo. And then Stuart's a professional engineer, so coming up from the professional engineering perspective, John, our sales guy there, is an engineer as well. So it's a combo of engineering and geology looking at hydrologic problems with electricity.
One common misconception is that this is a trained monkey exercise in the field where we just throw electrode stakes in the ground and magically collect data and we have all the answers. It's really a quite involved process to do it correctly and get good quality data. So our staff consists mostly of engineers and geologists and professional degreed folks that go out to the field and then also do the follow-up work in the office. It takes that sort of horsepower to get this level of data and interpretation. Well, we're past the bottom of the hour. I don't see any other questions. Really appreciate everybody's time. On screen is our contact information, so if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out anytime, whether it's 5 minutes from now or a day or a week or a month. We're going to send out a follow-up email with the presentation recording from this webinar, so you can view it again or distribute it to other folks in your organizations, etc. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, John. I'll go ahead and close the webinar, and everybody have a good rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks.